Hello, this video is going to go through calculating labour costs and overtime premium. I'm going to start off with a simple example and then look at something that's a bit more complicated and is similar to what turns up on your coursework. So starting with example 3.1. So we have an assembly company, they work at 35 hours and the rate of pay is £10 an hour. Overtime is paid at time and a half. During week 5, you're given some information on 2 workers who are employed to assemble products. Sam worked 38 hours, he's done some overtime and that was at the customer's request. Bill worked 40 hours, he's also done overtime but that was due to a backlog of orders. So you're required to calculate the total pay for each worker, clearly showing the overtime premium for each worker, and then also calculate the total pay and state how much would be direct and how much would be indirect. So if we just clarify overtime premium, that is the additional amount that you are paying your employees in order to encourage them to work overtime. In this example, the rate of pay is £10 and overtime is paid at time and a half, so that would be £15. So the premium is the extra £5 per hour that is being paid. Now that's a really important point. Students regularly mix up overtime and overtime premium. So you need to be sure that you are calculating the premium. You are calculating the extra amount that you pay. So if we start by looking at Sam, he's worked 38 hours, standard working week is 35. Now the way to approach this in order to guarantee that you get the premium right is firstly identify the total hours that the employee worked. So Sam worked 38 hours. So for every one of those hours, he is going to get at least £10. So for every hour worked, he gets the basic rate of pay. So that's 380. Now look at the overtime. He did 3 hours overtime. So for those 3 hours, he will get an extra £5 an hour. That's £15. So his total for the week, 395. And by calculating it this way, we know immediately how much the overtime premium is. So the extra that he's been paid. So for 3 hours, he was paid an extra £5. Now if we do the same for Bill. He worked 40 hours, so that's the starting point, the total hours worked. So for every one of those hours, he will be paid £10. So he's got £400. Now look at how many of those hours were in overtime. Normal working week is 35, he did 40, so we have 5 hours of overtime. So for those 5 hours, he got an extra £5. So that's another £25. Giving a total of £425. And again, we know how much the premium is. It's the extra amount paid. So that extra £25. So we've now completed the first part of the question. It said to calculate the total pay for each worker. And we've done that. Clearly show the overtime premium for each worker. We've done that. We've got the premium for Sam, the premium for Bill. We're then asked to calculate the total pay. Right, so total pay, £395 plus 425, £820. So we've calculated total pay. How much would be direct and how much would be indirect? So starting with direct, remember the definition of direct labour is the labour hours spent producing the products, where we're told that both Sam and Bill are employed to assemble products. So their hours that they work are direct. If you think about the overtime premium, we classify overtime premium generally as indirect unless it is at the request of the customer. In that case, it will be direct. So if we look at Sam, 38 hours, £380. So those hours were spent assembling products. So they are direct hours. £15 overtime premium. We're told that Sam worked overtime at the customer's request. So that £15 is also direct. Now if we move on to Bill, £400 assembling products, so that's direct. Overtime premium, well, Bill worked overtime due to a backlog of orders. So his overtime was not at the customer request. Therefore, the overtime premium is indirect. Okay, so if we just total up the direct figure, £795, and the indirect is £25. So that's the question completed. We've calculated the total pay, 820, stated how much of it would be direct, 795, and how much would be indirect. So you can hopefully see that if you approach your calculation in this manner, it then makes it very easy to pick out the premium, and it also makes it easier to decide how much is direct and how much is indirect. So please do practice it this way. I'm sure that you would probably calculate it in an alternative method, which will result in the same answer, but this method always separates out the premium, and questions will ask you for the overtime premium. So try and get used to doing it this way. So that's the first example. I'm going to now turn to a more complicated example, and we're going to work through that one. Right, so here we have a building company. They're a building business who work in the domestic market and include jobs such as building garages, house extensions and loft conversions. They employ 15 builders on permanent contracts. The rate of pay, £20 per hour, overtime paid, time and a quarter. Work beyond 4 o'clock and at the weekend is considered overtime. You then have the timesheet for 2 of their employees. We've got Bob, and we're told the hours that he worked, AM and PM, what he was doing, and we can also see that he worked on Saturday. We've then got M much, and same information, hours worked, including on a Saturday, what he was doing, and any notes. And what you're required to do is to calculate the total pay per builder and in total, and to classify the total into direct or indirect, and to explain how the overtime premium has been treated. So you'll see again it's asking about the overtime premium. So if you think back to the last example that we did, the first thing that I did was take the total hours that were worked by each employee and multiplied it by the rate of pay. So we need to do the same here. So what were the total hours worked by each employee? So if we look at Bob, Monday 8 till 12:30, so that's 4.5 hours. He stopped for lunch, he started again at 1 and worked through to 4, so that's another 3 hours. So we've got 4.5 and we've got 3. So he did 7.5 hours. Tuesday is the same. Wednesday, he did an extra hour in the afternoon, so he's done 8.5 hours. Thursday, 8 to 12:30, 1 to 4, that's 7.5 again. Friday, another 7.5, and Saturday 8 to 12:30, 4.5 hours. So he's totalled 43 hours. So as I said, same as we did in the last example, take the total number of hours he worked, multiply it by the rate of pay. So that's £860. Then, did he do any overtime for which he got more than £20? Well, overtime is work beyond 4 p.m. Okay, we already know that. So on Wednesday, we can see he worked to 5 p.m. So he's done 1 hour overtime. That was the only day he worked late, but we also know hours worked at the weekend is overtime. So those 4.5 hours that he did on Saturday is also overtime. So he did 5.5 hours of overtime. So for 5.5 hours, he gets extra, and he gets a quarter extra. So a quarter of 20 is £5. So 5.5 hours at £5 is £27.50. So this is the premium. And if we total it up, in total Bob earned £887.50. So the important thing is I've used exactly the same method as I used on the earlier example. Identified the total hours worked and paid the basic rate of pay. Identified the hours of overtime for which I then paid the extra premium. Now if we look at M much, same method. How many hours did he work? On Monday, 8 to 12:30, 1 till 4, we know that's 7.5 hours. And actually, if we look at every day of the week, he worked 7.5 hours every day. So He did no work beyond 4 o'clock. Saturday, he did 8 to 12:30, so that's 4.5 hours, and 1 till 3, so that's another 2. So he did 6.5 hours on Saturday, so in total 44 hours. So we know 44 hours going to be paid £20, £880. Now, overtime. Well, he didn't work beyond 4 o'clock during the week, so no overtime during the week. But on the weekend, he did 6.5 hours, and weekend work is considered overtime. So for 6.5 hours, he gets an extra £5. So that's £32.50. So that is the premium. Add them together, and we've got M. Much's wages for the week, £912.50. So look at what's required. Calculate the total pay per builder. So we've done that, and in total. So let's just add the two together. So total pay, 887.50 plus 912.50, £1,800. So that's the first part of that one done. So as long as you approach it in the same way as we've done before, this one's fairly straightforward. So firstly, what are the total hours worked? Multiply it by the rate of pay. What are the extra hours worked, the overtime? Multiply that by the overtime premium, the extra bit you're paying. So extra hours times extra bit of pay. So now, what else do we have to do? We need to classify the labour total into direct or indirect and explain how the overtime premium has been treated. So in other words, have we treated the overtime premium as direct, or have we treated it as indirect? Now this needs a little bit of analysis. We can start with the overtime premium. So we have £27.50 for Bob and £32.50 for M. Much. Remember, the overtime premium is indirect unless it is at the request of the customer. Now in the information we've got here, there is nothing to say that overtime was at the request of the customer. We just know that the overtime was worked on loft conversions and house extensions. In the absence of that information, that it was at the direct request of the customer, we assume it was general overtime and therefore we will treat it as indirect. So in answer to how the overtime premium has been treated, the overtime premium is being treated as indirect. So overtime premium is indirect. Okay, so we need to look at our labour and decide what is direct and what is indirect. So let's look at Bob. If we look at the information given, he was working on loft conversions, so that's your direct labour, directly associated with the job. But on 2 hours on Tuesday, he was spent in a meeting. So those 2 hours were not direct working on the job. So those 2 hours are indirect. Everything else that he did was direct. If we look at M. Much, Monday he wasn't able to do any work. He was waiting for a job. He still has to be paid. He's on a contract. He needs to be paid. But if he wasn't actually working on a job, then that is indirect. So that's 7.5 hours is indirect. So that's now going to help. So we know our overtime premium was indirect, and that was £27.50 and £32.50. We also know that for Bob, there were 2 hours when he was paid £20 an hour. That was indirect work. And for M. Much, there was 7.5 hours for which he was paid £20 an hour, which again was indirect work. So totaling that up, indirect £250. So we've taken the overtime premium as indirect. We've taken the hours when they weren't doing loft conversions or house extensions as indirect. All the rest of the time, they were working on direct work. So we can either work it out looking at the hours, or the easiest way is we know total pay is £1,800. We know that indirect is £250. So if we take that away, what's left, £1,550 is the direct labour. So we've answered the question completely. So we calculated the total pay per builder and in total. We've then classified that total, so that £1,800, into how much of it was direct, 1,550, and how much of it was indirect, 250. And we've explained how the overtime premium has been treated. If you were doing this as an actual question, you would have a written explanation. We've treated it as indirect, as no evidence that it was requested by the customer. And that's it. Now this, if it was part of a coursework question, would probably be worth in the region of about 10-15 marks, and it often causes difficulty for the students. But hopefully, having seen how I've worked through this, you'll see that it's not actually that hard if you take a logical approach to it. So just to emphasise again, I know I've said it several times already, first step, work out the total hours, and for every one of those hours, pay the rate of pay. Then look at how many of the total hours were actually overtime, and for those hours, pay the extra, so pay the premium. Add it together and you have total pay per employee. By doing it that way, it's easy to identify how much the premium is. Then you can identify whether it's direct or indirect, depending on whether it was at the customer request. We then went on and looked to decide how many of the hours that we've paid may have been indirect hours. So we've seen if they spent time in a meeting, that was indirect. If they were waiting for work, that was indirect. Other things that you could come across, if they're off sick, if they're on holiday, if they're on training courses, they would all be classed as indirect. Still need to be paid, but it's the classification. When they're working on a job, it's classed as direct. So I hope that's clarified the calculations for labour, and we will be looking at various questions when we next meet.